So Dr. Dan Kaiser is going to be our first presenter. He is a nutrient management extension specialist. He works for the University of Minnesota Extension on the Twin Cities campus, although he has done research throughout the entire state of Minnesota. So Dr. Kaiser is going to be talking to us today about what current research is telling us about managing fertilizer for soybean.
Okay. So what I'm going to talk about today is some of the research we've been doing looking specifically at soybean fertilizer guidelines. I'm going to break this into a couple different sections, but mainly what I'm going to start off here with just kind of my overall overriding tips here for managing soybean fertilization. I'll go through some of these as we move forward, just showing you some of the current data and what we're doing with some of that data. But the primary thing I've been focusing on with most growers is focusing on their foundation of their soil fertility program. So looking for P&K, mostly soil testing, and focusing on those applications. And for a lot of you up in the Red River Valley, up that far north, dealing with your iron chlorosis issues, I know are kind of I put those as 1-2 in terms of, if we look at what's going to make the most bang for the buck, because those are likely what we're going to see the largest yield deficits if those aren't taken care of. Timing, I'll talk a little bit about this. There's been more questions on that, particularly with potassium and phosphorus in rotations. Some more focus, particularly with high yielding beans, on going to every year applications. I'm just going to give you my general thoughts on kind of what the data is telling me for those two. And then also really don't buy what you don't need. And this, I'll talk a little bit about sulfur and micros at the end, because that's kind of, that fits within those categories. So be about a year and a half or 2 years ago, I went through and I started looking at our current potassium guidelines in Minnesota. For some of you that don't know, our guidelines are based on what we call the sufficiency approach. That's historically what they've been based on. They haven't been based on a build and maintenance approach, which I'm going to talk about with phosphorus, because I'm looking at a dual set of guidelines for phosphorus, which may eventually move into potassium. But one of the major changes is just one of the data that was starting to tell us that we needed more for potassium. And then also, if we looked at some of our critical levels, we were starting to identify a higher need, particularly in our high clay soils, which a lot of you if you've got heavier soils, this would fit within this category, where we see a critical level of about 200 part per million, which in the past would have been about 160. So that was one of the main changes that I made with the updated guidelines. And we'll be continually evaluating this as we go, because I'm looking at potentially some modifications for some of you that are dealing with sands versus clay soils that may impact the amount of potassium that we suggest applying, just because of how different those soils are and how differently they retain potassium compared to one another. One of the other things that I've been looking at has been source of potassium. Some of you may have seen some of this data or maybe hearing more about it. A lot of this was looking at potassium chloride, because it's our main source. 98% of our sales in Minnesota are potassium chloride. So we really don't have another source out there. And we've been seeing some issues, particularly with chloride, that a lot of the southern U.S. has dealt with. That they've looked at variety selection for situations where they have a lot of chloride being applied, because it can make a big difference because of the sensitivity that that soybean has to chloride itself. So yield reductions right now, if you look at some of the newer NDSU recommendations for corn, I know Dave looked at capping what he recommends for potash applications for a maximum amount of head of corn. For Minnesota, we don't have that. For soybean, though, I did work that into our guidelines, mainly because of some of these issues that we've seen. The thing about this, if we look at soybean and chloride tolerance, this isn't a new issue. If I look, and I'll show you some of the data. And what's interesting about it is most of the time, if you do get a yield reduction, it's going to be small enough where you're likely not going to see it. And that's one of the things about this issue that has been interesting. It's just that it can go from a very big issue to a very small issue. And with the small issues, it's really hard to see. You're not really going to notice it over time, just because it's a very small yield reduction. One of the things I did do with one of our studies that we had funding from the Minnesota soybean growers, we were looking at 10-year long-term studies looking at the impact of timing in corn and soybean rotations. One thing about the study, we were looking at all before corn or all before beans and a split application to get us a general idea on what was the best option for the corn soybean rotation. And what we're seeing in most cases, these are just southern to west central Minnesota. This Delavan site, a very poorly drained, tile drained site. More rainfall at this site and really no difference in terms of yield. And this is looking at yield increases or decreases of comparisons of timing. So this says before soybean, we were getting a 4.3 bushel advantage versus the split application. So this is really relevant. What I want to talk about are these here. And this would be the, where we start looking at these yield increases that we're seeing. And this is showing that we were getting about a bushel to a bushel half yield increase to the soybean when we applied all of our potassium ahead of the corn at this site at Lamberton, which is a higher clay site, versus Morris, where it was a split, where we're seeing the split giving us a better yield advantage of about 1 bushel to the acre. Now, this isn't consistent where I can make a consistent recommendation across all sites. This is going to be somewhat site specific. But what it's telling me essentially is that if you look at all these sites, that putting the entire slug ahead of soybeans really wasn't a good idea. So that's kind of the main thing I've been stressing to a lot of growers with some of the data that we've been seeing, that these higher application rates, we can see some issues, and we have to be very careful in terms of how much we apply ahead of the soybean crop. So in 2020, this last year, I wanted to look at some of these sites to see if we could separate out the potassium and the chloride issues at some of the studies. This is an average, this is looking at Morris, West Central Minnesota, very dry year, looking at about an 18 bushel per acre yield reduction for both potassium chloride and calcium chloride when we applied it at 500 pounds of chloride to the acre. So this is a pretty substantial rate of chloride being applied to these sites, but we're trying to specifically induce some of these yield reductions. The other two locations, it was about a 3.5 bushel per acre disadvantage of having the chloride out there. So these smaller sites, and I'll show you an example with much lower rates that we see very small yield reductions. And this is a pretty extreme case we're seeing in terms of that. But what this does point to me, if you look at potassium chloride versus calcium chloride, that the reductions were the same. So that would indicate that it is indeed the chloride, not the potassium, that's causing us these problems with these yield reductions. So as I said at the beginning, we started looking at very small yield reductions. It's kind of what we've been seeing consistently with a number of our sites. The thing I want to point out here, though, is that these are a set of locations we've had. This is 3 years of data at these sites where we're looking at continual applications in either a corn soybean or a wheat soybean rotation, looking at either 100 or 200 pounds of K2O per acre. So looking at somewhere in the range of removal to 2 times removal at these particular sites. The things that we're seeing here is at Crookston, seeing about a 2 bushel yield advantage from the potassium, lower soil tests at this site around 120 to 150 part per million, and no difference in terms of our timing. So either before the wheat or before the soybean, it really didn't matter. We were getting a response to the potassium where it made sense to apply potassium because the soil tests were low. The site at Waseca, though, this is one of the things that, again, if I look at a lot of our data historically, you know, what we're probably seeing with some of these yield reductions with chloride are probably in that range of about a bushel to the acre. So this isn't something that you're normally likely going to see. If you're looking at your fields, that 18 bushel yield reduction would be a lot easier to see with that higher application rate. But a lot of these issues with chloride, and it's why I say this chloride issue has been around for a long time, we just haven't noticed it, that it's most likely going to be that half to a bushel difference in many of the sites where we're over applying it, we didn't need to apply it itself. For comparison wise at Crookston, this is just spring wheat data, again showing us about a bushel to 2 bushel per acre yield response in the spring wheat. We're also picking up about a tenth to 0.2% protein increase with these locations. So again, where it makes sense to apply it because it's low, it still makes sense to apply it, even with some of these issues we're seeing with the source. But if it isn't needed, we just have to be careful in terms of looking at some of these sensitive crops to make sure we're not over applying chloride and getting into some of these 2-3 bushel yield reductions that we've seen at some of the sites. So what do you need to know about it? Again, the 500 pounds is extreme, but if you are dealing with recommendations that might be looking at some of this base saturation style recommendations, you can get into some of these higher rates of chloride. So you have to be careful with that. And it really doesn't matter. There's some soils that be more prone where a lot of your crops, you may be seeing some yield reduction, with that large of an application rate. So it's one of the things to kind of watch out for, that I have seen recommendations that it might be possible to get up to this. But for the most part, if you're looking at a recommendation where we have right now of no more than 100 pounds of actual potash per acre, you're not going to see rates quite that high. So again, apply it when it's needed. These maintenance applications, if your soil test is high, just be careful with the amount you're applying, particularly if you're doing it ahead of soybean. And we'll continue to work on it. And that's one of the things that I will put a plug in for Minnesota Crop News. It's one of the avenues which we release a lot. So if any of you are interested in kind of as we go, again, we're kind of midpoint of, if you're looking at additional information moving forward. Phosphorus, the main change I made with phosphorus, I did add a removal-based set of guidelines in addition to our older sufficiency guidelines. This is mainly just to look at situations where growers are looking at a removal-based system. It's not that I'm recommending it across the state, because I know there's some issues with it in some areas of the state where you can't build soils, but it's just giving some guidance based on what we see with the data and economics. So looking at just a percentage of crop removal based on where we're at. This is with the Bray test, and that's really where I'd recommend this be used more if you're going to use it situations where the Bray test will work. If you're using the Olson predominantly, those are soils that it can be difficult to build, and we do see that essentially fertilization of a low, we still see the same yield potential as maintaining a high. So in the end, the crop doesn't care where the phosphorus comes from, as long as it has sufficient amounts there, whether it's fertilizer or the soil, the yield potential is the same. But moving forward, this is one thing we're likely going to do with potassium as well. I'm just kind of in the early stages of this, and it gives some options for growers looking at their attitudes towards risk and also land tenure. So the question of whether or not to use it, can you build your soil, I think is the main question. If it's yes, the question, that's why I went to this dual set of systems, is just as overriding question, is it better off to apply a low rate continually over time, or modify our rate just based on soil test, adjusting constantly based on where those soil tests are going? And this is a kind of a land tenure issue. If you look at this, how much you're willing to invest over time, and how secure you are in terms of that investment. If you don't use that phosphorus in 1 year, will you be able to access it, or will you lose the land, and will you're the next person that rents it be able to get it? And so that's kind of the main question, particularly with a build system, is just land tenure in a whole. So then if it's no, then the question really, when I look at it, then why build? If you don't have, if you can't build it, why build it? Because research again shows us that sufficiency will work if you're soil testing enough to be able to catch some of those lows to make sure you're not under fertilizing some of those fields themselves. Timing wise, when's the best time to apply? We had some similar data looking at some of the potassium data I showed earlier. These locations were all sites that had pHs of 7.5 or less. And in those cases, timing really mattered more for a corn, or I would say for a wheat crop where you have phosphorus ahead of those crops. And the soybean really didn't care. But after I started talking about this, I was starting to get a little bit of pushback from some growers in west central, northwest Minnesota. So I wanted to take another look at some of our really high pH sites to look at timing itself. So I dug back into some data we had back in 2010 and 2011. This was central Minnesota, looking at a corn soybean rotation. This is where we had no pair strips with 200 pounds P205, showing a sizable bushels to the acre from that 200-pound rate. The interesting thing, though, is when the follow-up years, when we looked at this site, is that you really couldn't even tell from the yield side that phosphorus was there. We put 200 pounds down. It should have been enough to supply both crops, but we still saw a yield response to that additional 150 pounds where we went in and split our strips, and we put a fresh application on half of the strips where we didn't have phosphorus the year before. Now, these yields aren't anything to write home about. The site had some issues with IDC. But this is pretty consistent when I started looking at some of the other data to what we're seeing. So we get to a situation where your pH is 7, 9, 8 or greater, you're seeing more of an advantage from that split application over time. The exception was a site we had near Foxhome. Similar conditions, albeit a little bit higher Olson pH value. We started at 7 versus 3. And that site, actually the soybean yielded higher where we put the phosphorus on ahead of the wheat. So I said it's hit or miss, but for the most part, if you look at a lot of our studies right now, I mean, really shows, and that's what I'm recommending, anything 7, 9 or higher, really looking at a split application of phosphorus, because you're really going to be looking at a better yield advantage in those situations. And fall versus spring makes a bigger deal, I think, for corn when it comes to a spring application. This is kind of an interesting data set we had. This is showing relative efficiency of 90 pounds applied in the fall versus 90 in the spring, seeing a yield advantage of corn, where we're looking at about a 50% greater efficiency with the spring application. With soybean, the story is completely different. And this is, if you looked at the two, there really wasn't that big of a difference where we saw that interaction occurring. What we did see was about a 1 bushel per acre yield increase for a fall application relative to a spring. And the efficiency wise, it was pretty much across the board in terms of overall rate. So what it's telling me, if we look at a lot of our data, is that we're seeing a much stronger benefit from a fall application to soybean versus the corn, which favored a spring application itself. So it's one of the things that we have more locations out looking at this moving forward, but it'll be interesting to see what this 2021 data shows, but it does seem to favor a fall application if you're putting on any phosphorus ahead of the soybean itself. So some things to consider when managing phosphorus. I mean, soil testing is a major thing to consider because getting a handle on where you're at is really important, particularly if you're using a sufficiency style approach and trying to apply only what the crop needs. For timing, again, every year application I think is more critical for your high pH soils. Fall application, again, seems to be favored by soybean. If you're looking at other crops like wheat or corn, I would look at, if you're doing a fall application, at least including some sort of starter in with that. I'm kind of wondering if that can break some of that efficiency issues we're seeing. If you have a small amount applied ahead of it, if we could do just as well as that with kind of at fall versus spring with the starter application. And really looking at, there isn't one best strategy. And that's really why I'm looking at this dual type system, because if I look at the eastern part of Minnesota versus the western part of Minnesota, there's different goals for the producers have. The soils are different and the strategies can be different. And there can be multiple pathways to getting very high economic returns with different strategies. So that's one of the things why I wanted to just look at what's the best options and what I'd recommend for certain scenarios. And that's really why we're at moving forward. So to wrap up, I just have some comments on sulfur. Having questions and just looking at some data control versus ammonium sulfate. We're in the southeastern part of Minnesota. If you look at a lot of our data from the northwest part of Minnesota, we just haven't been able to track clear yield responses to sulfur ahead of soybean. Other than sites near Staples, where we had irrigated sites with low irrigation totals that weren't putting a lot of sulfur on annually. So there's some areas out there that you might see a response, but overall, it isn't going to be widespread unless you're dealing with very low organic matter soils, 2% or less, and situations where you're not putting sulfur on ahead of any other crops. And that's kind of the two areas that I see merging together that where we see sulfur responses occur in soybean. In micros, we've looked at this a number of times, and I have not been able to track any consistent data that shows a very clear response to any micronutrient across a wide range of soils across the state. Manganese for soybean would be the only one that you may want to watch, and I've seen some responses when we get lower than about a 10 part per million soil DTPA soil test, but it still seemed to be only about 50-50. And the recommendation of not neglecting your foundation, your PK and your IDC management versus and go to some of these micronutrients, because the return isn't going to be there compared to what some of these other returns that we've seen, particularly with some of these foundational nutrients that are more likely going to be deficient across the state. So, kind of to wrap up, the few things to consider, again, focus on your P&K management, your IDC. I didn't talk about IDC, variety selection, in-furrow, EDDHA, ortho products are your best options. We start looking at pH is less than 5, which is probably not a lot of you, or 7 or 9 and greater, which is more likely going to be. And then managing your K to reduce the impacts of chloride. And again, maximum what we're recommending in Minnesota right now is no more than about 100 pounds of potash, but we know there's situations where you could go with a higher rate if you have enough rainfall and drainage, where you might be able to double that up to about 200 pounds and not see much of an issue. But again, these things are hard to track because a lot of times it's just about a half to a bushel that we're seeing a yield reduction consistently across these sites. So you're really not going to see it as closely as you would if we've seen some of these larger benefits. Liming, for most of western Minnesota, I don't think this is much of an issue. The pH and the subsoil pH is high enough where we don't see a good return on investment. But if you're in kind of the central, the western part of the state, that can matter. Sulfur, again, for most of you, if you're applying it ahead of other crops, corn, wheat, or canola, I doubt it's going to be much of an issue for beans because we see some carryover from one year to the next. And then nitrogen is one that I have seen in the northwest part of the state, particularly on fields where they're newly going into beans. Options are to apply nitrogen or inoculate, but remember that your phosphorus and sulfur will contain some nitrogen, and also that your nitrogen applications can impact IDC. So that's one of the things with it. There's a balance there as well, but we haven't seen any firm data if we start looking at consistently where outside of some of these isolated circumstances with newly planted beans in fields where nitrogen really has mattered. So with that, again, I want to put a plug in for Minnesota Crop News. Because again, if any of you are looking for information, that's where I would go, particularly newer information as we go, because a lot of these things are kind of on the newer front in terms of what we're seeing for that. So with that, I want to thank you for your time. And if we have some time for questions, I'll be glad to take them.
All right, thank you, Dan. We got a couple questions rolling in here. The first question is in regard to sulfur in soybean on heavy soils. So the question says there was a report out of Purdue about the response of applying sulfur ahead of soybeans and seeing a double-digit % increase in yield for heavy soils with high organic matter. Do you have any comments on that?
Well, one of the things we're looking at for some of the higher organic matter soils, particularly the heavier soils, I'm trying to track what's happening, particularly with the forms of sulfur, to see if, while there seems to be a lot there, if you take a soil test, if whether or not the forms are shifting to unavailable forms. And you see that a lot with corn. It's pretty easy to see early in the growing season when the corn stripes early on that we're likely seeing some availability issues. So it's one of the things I'm trying to track to whether that's an issue. Being that beans are generally planted later, for most of our soils, I think that's kind of where we see, even if there are some issues early on, that the way the forms of sulfur in the soil change, that the availability hasn't been as much of an issue. So it's one of the things that, again, just tracking it, a lot of my responses have been all on soils that have had very low application rates to the previous crops. So if you're dealing with corn, if you're using micro essentials lines, I doubt you're going to see much of an issue because some of that's going to carry over to the beans itself. So there's a lot of things that kind of factor in with that. And with most of our soils, we just haven't been able to consistently see it on some of the heavier soils, particularly in beans. It's been more likely to see in corn that we see those deficiencies in some of those heavier soils in the majority of Minnesota. Awesome,
thank you. We got another question. George Rem always used to say that making potassium fertilizer recommendations based on base saturation was bogus and not supported by unbiased research. Has any of that changed?
So the base saturation data that we've seen, I'm looking at it in some of the data I showed from Crookston, those beans, we're looking at it just to see the change in the base saturation. The problem really with it is cost, and what really concerns me, to change the base saturation, you tend to need a lot of fertilizer. And if we look at a lot of this chloride data I'm seeing, we can see a yield reduction with high application rates. You're spending a lot of money on fertilizer, and the data, indeed, it really hasn't changed that. Again, we're not really seeing any consistency in those, the differences in the base saturation. So I haven't really seen anything that changes from what George had before, but we are looking at it again because I know it's just the cyclical thing that we get more questions on. So I just want to make sure we can confirm that, because it seems like even with these lower application rates of K, we still see a decent response that we don't need to worry too much about what that base saturation ratio is, because it's just really hard to change for many of our soils.
Thank you. Next question. A little time for some more here. Is tillage practice? I think this might be regarding tillage in general or any particular tillage practice important after P&K application.
It depends. We know I have a lot of flexibility. Phosphorus, if you look at a lot of the data, no-till versus phosphorus incorporated, there hasn't been as much of a difference. It's been potassium that's mostly been the issue. So if you look at conservation tillage, where you're getting a lot of stratification of potassium, we know particularly if the surface soil is dry that we tend to have more issues with uptake. So that's the one where having some incorporation tends to help, particularly getting it down deeper where there's some water to aid with the uptake. But it hasn't been consistent, but it's been the one that's shown more than anything else. So I think there's some flexibility there. Do what works best with the system you're in. And potassium is the one that, if you're dealing with lower K tests, is one that you might want to look at, particularly if you're in a reduced till situation, some sort of band application.
All right, we'll try to stick with some of the soybean questions here. What are your thoughts on applying starter fertilizer on soybeans for their phosphate needs?
You want my simple answer is don't. I mean, the problem with it is it's risky. We know that most products, even with some of the low salt products, can cause problems. And I know, talking to some growers up in the area that have tried it, there's been same thing with it. It's still probably better to broadcast, just based on the data with that. The starter, I would just kind of shy away from, just to avoid some of the stand reductions.
Gotcha. There's some evidence that shows that especially high yielding soybeans need some nitrogen application to get those high yields. What are your thoughts on nitrogen in soybeans?
So Fabian Fernandez had some data. He had some soybean yields that were 80 plus. This has been a few years ago where they applied nitrogen, and they were seeing indeed some yield increase. The problem he had with it, though, the amount of nitrogen he needed to get the yield increase was much than what he was getting in the yield advantage itself. So that's nitrogen demander. I mean, you look at renewable, it's more than corn. But typically, if you get enough nodulation, you shouldn't have that much of an issue. Now, I've had some data out of the northern part of the valley where we had 20, 30 pounds, where we're seeing, a 4 to 5 bushel yield increase, but it wasn't what we call these high yield. It was probably more in that 50 range versus, which might be high yield for some people, but it's not the 80s and 90s where we tend to see some of these advantages. So that's kind of the thing. I mean, there's some advantage at times. It isn't consistent, but the amount of nitrogen required may be well more than, what really is going to make up for the what you're seeing for the yield advantage of the soybean itself.
All right, I think we've got one more question, unless we get any others submitting, and then we'll have a poll for our attendees watching as well here pretty quick. But this question has to do with corn, so we'll switch topics for a little bit. He was the question asker was just wondering about sulfur on corn for heavy valley soils that are under no-till.
So, this is an interesting thing because a couple of years back, there was reports of essentially all the corn going striped in the valley. We had some sulfur trials out that year, which was advantageous, and we had on some fields where we had some striping. And, the data we saw outside of some of the sandier sites that were low organic matter, we really didn't see a yield advantage from it, even though the fields themselves, you could see some striping still on them kind of mid to late in the growing season. So it kind of depends. For most of your heavier soils with organic matter above 3% or above 4%, probably don't see a consistent issue. The thing you have to realize, though, is, if you're applying phosphorus in particular, most of our sources contain 3 to 5% sulfur, of those MAP or DAP. Even sources, just straight MAP or DAP that aren't the Micro Essentials line, which actually have sulfur listed in them, where you get a small amount on a year-to-year basis. And if it's striped, we have to disconnect striping early in the season from later in the season, because we know that if we can get enough sulfur available by about V5, we don't tend to see much of a yield reduction. So if I look at the high organic matter, the heavier valley soils, I mean, the advantage, there'd probably be slightly greener early in the growing season. I'm just not necessarily sure there's going to be a yield advantage with it. But, there are years where we may have issues where there might be, but I think it's not going to be consistent. The thing about it is that if you're using Micro Essentials for your phosphate source, I don't think I'd worry about it, because just based on the fact that you're getting some sulfur with that, you're likely not going to see any advantage to applying additional sulfur in terms of what you're applying. If you're not using it, Again, MAP has some, and you're probably going to get with 100 pounds of P2O5, get about 3 to 5 pounds of sulfur, which in most cases is what we've seen we're going to need. So I mean, it's really situational where there is, but consistency wise, you know, we can see some striping early in the growing season. As long as it's mostly gone by V5, it shouldn't be that much of an issue, and we shouldn't see any yield reductions from that. If you have any additional questions on that, my email's there. Just we can follow up at a later time, and I can kind of share some of that data that we had on that.
Well, thank